The year was 1942. Berlin was cold and dark in the early winter months, but inside the German High Command building, the atmosphere was heated and tense. The war had raged for over 3 years, and Germany had struck deep into Russia while its U-boats prowled the Atlantic, trying to starve Britain of supplies. The mood among the generals was still determined, but cracks had begun to show. Losses in Russia were mounting. British bombers were hitting German cities more often. Still, there was hope that Germany could win if it held its ground and forced its enemies to the negotiation table. That hope began to fade when a single intelligence report landed on a polished oak table in the map room of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW. A courier had brought it straight from the Abwehr, the military intelligence service. The paper was thin and worn from travel, but the numbers it carried were heavy. It contained the latest estimate of American ship production. When the officer reading it spoke, the room went silent. In a clear, measured voice, he read that the United States had built more than 6,000 new ships in just 1 year. These were not small boats. The list included Liberty ships, destroyers, tankers, and escort carriers. Several men in the room frowned in disbelief. General Alfred Jodl, a senior planner, leaned forward. 6,000? That must be an error, he said sharply. Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, gripped the edge of the table. He knew shipbuilding numbers better than anyone. Germany had been sinking Allied ships at a fierce pace in the early part of the year, during what the U-boat crews called the Second Happy Time. British and American merchant ships were going down faster than the Allies could replace them, or so the Germans thought. The officer laid another sheet on the table. It showed the names of newly launched ships and the shipyards where they had been built. The United States had opened 18 major shipyards, many of them on the east and west coasts. They ran day and night with hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them women and men who had never worked in a yard before the war. Using new assembly line methods, they could build a Liberty ship in as little as 42 days. Some shipyards had reduced that time even further, down to a few weeks. The generals exchanged looks. Germany had no way to match this pace. German shipyards were smaller and relied on skilled labor and older methods. They could build only a handful of U-boats and surface ships each month. In raw numbers, they were outmatched beyond calculation. Donitz spoke first. Even if every U-boat sinks 1 ship a month, they will still fall behind, he said. His voice was flat, almost cold. We cannot sink them faster than they can build them. This realization cut to the heart of German naval strategy. The U-boat campaign was designed to starve Britain by cutting off supplies of food, fuel, and war material. In the first months of 1942, U-boats had roamed freely off the American East Coast, sinking ships almost at will. But now, with thousands of new ships joining the convoys, the Allies could replace their losses faster than the U-boats could inflict them. The war map on the wall showed the Atlantic covered in small pins representing convoy routes. Every day, more pins appeared. German intelligence reports now confirmed that Allied convoys were growing in size and were better protected by new escort carriers and destroyers. The wolf pack tactics that had once terrified the Allies were starting to fail. The room filled with the scratch of pencils as aides took notes. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW, rubbed his forehead. He had been optimistic after early victories. Now he stared at the figures as though willing them to change. "How certain is this information?" he asked. The officer who delivered the report nodded. "Completely certain, Herr General Feldmarschall. The data comes from multiple sources. These numbers are confirmed." A heavy silence followed. Outside the room, Berlin buzzed with the usual wartime activity. But inside, the future of the Reich grew darker by the minute. Hitler himself was not present. He would hear of this report later, and his reaction would be explosive. Many of the generals suspected he would dismiss the numbers as enemy propaganda. But the men in the room knew the truth. The scale of American production was staggering. It was not only ships. Germany was also receiving reports of rising tank and aircraft production in the United States. The Americans were turning their entire economy into a war machine. It was something Germany could never match. The Reich had mobilized early and had relied on speed and surprise to win quick victories. But now, the conflict was becoming a long war of attrition, and the side with greater resources would eventually win. One by one, the generals began to speak. Some argued that they must redouble their efforts, build more U-boats, strike harder. Donitz shook his head. Even if we double our production, it will not be enough, he said. We are fighting an enemy that can outbuild us 10-1. The conversation turned to tactics. They discussed shifting U-boats to new hunting grounds, targeting fuel tankers, and focusing on choke points like the Straits of Gibraltar. Yet even these ideas felt like trying to plug holes in a dam with bare hands. Every ship sunk would be replaced within weeks. As the meeting ended, the mood was grim. Some of the generals avoided each other's eyes as they filed out. They understood, even if Hitler did not, that Germany's chances of victory had slipped away without a single battle being fought. The war would continue, and men would still fight and die, but from this moment, they knew the outcome was no longer in doubt. The United States faced a huge challenge after entering the war in December 1941. Merchant ships were being sunk faster than they could be built. Supplies had to cross the Atlantic to reach Britain and later North Africa. Without ships, there could be no invasion, no steady flow of tanks, planes, fuel, and food. American leaders understood this clearly. They decided to attack the problem the same way they built cars and machines before the war, through mass production on an industrial scale that had never been tried with ships before. Henry J. Kaiser, a businessman with experience in building dams and large construction projects, took the lead in this effort. Kaiser had never built a ship before the war, but he saw a way to speed up the process. Traditionally, shipbuilding was slow and relied on small teams of skilled craftsmen. Each vessel was built almost by hand. A single merchant ship could take many months to complete. Kaiser rejected that model. He believed that ships could be built like cars, using prefabricated parts and assembly line methods. Kaiser's shipyards spread across the American coasts, from Portland and Richmond on the west coast to yards in the Gulf and along the Atlantic seaboard. By 1942, 18 new yards were running at full speed. They operated around the clock, with 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. Lights blazed over the docks at night so work never stopped. Sirens marked the start and end of each shift, and workers poured in and out in an unending stream. The workforce was massive, over 640,000 men and women. Many had never worked in a shipyard before. Women entered in large numbers, taking up welding, riveting, and machine work. African American and Hispanic workers joined the lines as well, often facing discrimination but vital to the effort. Training programs were set up to teach new skills quickly. A person could arrive with no experience and be welding steel plates within weeks. The ship itself was redesigned to fit this new style of production. The Liberty ship was the standard cargo vessel. It was simple, rugged, and designed to carry about 10,000 tons of cargo. Its parts were built in sections like a giant kit. These sections were then brought together and welded instead of riveted. Welding saved time and allowed less skilled labor to do the work. Some Liberty ships were finished in as little as 42 days. In rare cases, shipyards set records by building one in under a month. The speed was astonishing compared to pre-war standards. Before this system, building a merchant ship might take 8 months or more. Now, yards could launch multiple ships in a single week. Launch ceremonies became common events, with flags and speeches as each new vessel slid into the water. Across the country, newspapers reported the numbers, which rose month after month. By the end of 1942, more than 6,000 vessels had been built. The scale of this production stunned observers. The United States was not just replacing lost ships. It was flooding the oceans with new ones. These were not all cargo ships. The output included tankers, destroyer escorts, and even small aircraft carriers called escort carriers. These carriers were crucial for protecting convoys from U-boat attacks. Each one carried a handful of aircraft to spot and strike submarines before they could attack. While America built on this scale, Germany struggled to keep up. German shipyards worked hard, but they used older methods. Skilled labor was required for most of the process. The number of workers was smaller, and there was little room to expand. Germany built U-boats steadily, but the totals were low compared to the Allied output. A German yard might produce a few dozen submarines in a year, while American yards turned out thousands of ships of all types. The contrast could not have been sharper. German submarines were advanced and deadly, but they were expensive and slow to build. American Liberty ships were basic and cheap, but they came off the lines in overwhelming numbers. Even when U-boats sank a ship, another would be ready to take its place almost immediately. The process was carefully planned. The government worked with private companies, unions, and communities to keep production moving smoothly. Raw materials like steel were prioritized for shipbuilding. Railroads and trucks delivered parts on strict schedules. Workers lived in hastily built housing near the yards. Entire towns grew up around the shipyards, with schools, stores, and hospitals springing up to support the war effort. Kaiser's methods were not always perfect. There were mistakes and problems at first. Welded hulls sometimes cracked in cold water, leading to dangerous failures. Engineers studied these issues and made improvements. Each problem was treated as something to fix and learn from, not a reason to slow down. The pressure to produce never let up. As production grew, the United States developed a rhythm. Each yard knew its role. Some specialized in cargo ships, others in warships or tankers. Supplies moved in a steady flow. The system became a machine in itself, with human hands and minds as its moving parts. For the German High Command, these numbers were alarming. Intelligence reports showed the growth month by month. At first, they did not believe them. The figures seemed impossible. But captured documents and photographs confirmed the truth. Even the most skilled German planners could not find a way to counter such output. The Battle of the Atlantic depended on a balance between sinking ships and building new ones. In early 1942, German U-boats seemed to have the upper hand. Convoys were thinly protected, and losses were high. But by the end of the year, the tide was turning. New ships filled the convoys. New escorts hunted the U-boats. The balance shifted, and Germany's strategy began to fail. The American shipbuilding effort was more than numbers on a chart. It was the sound of hammers, the glare of welding torches, the constant roar of activity day and night. It was workers leaving their homes before dawn and returning after dark, tired but determined. It was the physical proof of a nation's decision to fight a global war with all its strength. The Atlantic Ocean was a battleground from the first day of the war. German leaders knew that Britain could not survive without steady supplies of food, fuel, and weapons. Everything Britain needed had to cross the sea. If those supply lines were cut, the island nation would starve, and its industry would grind to a halt. The weapon for this task was the U-boat. Fast, deadly, and hard to detect, these submarines became the core of Germany's naval strategy. From 1939 onward, U-boats hunted in groups called wolf packs. They stalked convoys, waited until night, then surfaced to attack with torpedoes. This tactic was effective because Allied escorts were too few, and radar and sonar were still primitive. A single wolf pack could sink several ships in a single night. German crews saw themselves as elite warriors, striking at the heart of Britain's lifeline. By early 1942, this strategy seemed unstoppable. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, its merchant ships were unprotected and often sailed alone along the East Coast. German U-boats moved in quickly. This period became known to German crews as the Second Happy Time. Ships were sunk so easily that U-boat commanders called the American coast their shooting gallery. Tankers and freighters burned in sight of American cities, their flames lighting the night sky. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, watched these victories with satisfaction. His reports to Berlin showed record tonnage sunk each month. He believed that if U-boats sank more shipping than the Allies could replace, victory was possible. This was known as the Tonnage War. For every ship lost, Allied production had to build another to keep up. If Germany sank enough, Britain would fall, and the Allies would be forced to negotiate. For a time, it looked like Donitz's plan might work. In the first half of 1942, Allied losses reached staggering levels. German radio broadcasts bragged about the sinkings. In Berlin, the Naval Command celebrated each success. Charts on the wall showed a steady rise in the amount of Allied shipping destroyed. But below the surface, trouble was brewing. The United States had begun to organize its defenses. Convoy systems. The year was 1942. Berlin was cold and dark in the early winter months, but inside the German High Command building, the atmosphere was heated and tense. The war had raged for over 3 years, and Germany had struck deep into Russia while its U-boats prowled the Atlantic, trying to starve Britain of supplies. The mood among the generals was still determined, but cracks had begun to show. Losses in Russia were mounting. British bombers were hitting German cities more often. Still, there was hope that Germany could win if it held its ground and forced its enemies to the negotiation table. That hope began to fade when a single intelligence report landed on a polished oak table in the map room of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW. A courier had brought it straight from the Abwehr, the military intelligence service. The paper was thin and worn from travel, but the numbers it carried were heavy. It contained the latest estimate of American ship production. When the officer reading it spoke, the room went silent. In a clear, measured voice, he read that the United States had built more than 6,000 new ships in just 1 year. These were not small boats. The list included Liberty ships, destroyers, tankers, and escort carriers. Several men in the room frowned in disbelief. General Alfred Jodl, a senior planner, leaned forward. 6,000? That must be an error, he said sharply. Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, gripped the edge of the table. He knew shipbuilding numbers better than anyone. Germany had been sinking Allied ships at a fierce pace in the early part of the year, during what the U-boat crews called the Second Happy Time. British and American merchant ships were going down faster than the Allies could replace them, or so the Germans thought. The officer laid another sheet on the table. It showed the names of newly launched ships and the shipyards where they had been built. The United States had opened 18 major shipyards, many of them on the east and west coasts. They ran day and night with hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them women and men who had never worked in a yard before the war. Using new assembly line methods, they could build a Liberty ship in as little as 42 days. Some shipyards had reduced that time even further, down to a few weeks. The generals exchanged looks. Germany had no way to match this pace. German shipyards were smaller and relied on skilled labor and older methods. They could build only a handful of U-boats and surface ships each month. In raw numbers, they were outmatched beyond calculation. Donitz spoke first. Even if every U-boat sinks 1 ship a month, they will still fall behind, he said. His voice was flat, almost cold. We cannot sink them faster than they can build them. This realization cut to the heart of German naval strategy. The U-boat campaign was designed to starve Britain by cutting off supplies of food, fuel, and war material. In the first months of 1942, U-boats had roamed freely off the American East Coast, sinking ships almost at will. But now, with thousands of new ships joining the convoys, the Allies could replace their losses faster than the U-boats could inflict them. The war map on the wall showed the Atlantic covered in small pins representing convoy routes. Every day, more pins appeared. German intelligence reports now confirmed that Allied convoys were growing in size and were better protected by new escort carriers and destroyers. The wolf pack tactics that had once terrified the Allies were starting to fail. The room filled with the scratch of pencils as aides took notes. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW, rubbed his forehead. He had been optimistic after early victories. Now he stared at the figures as though willing them to change. "How certain is this information?" he asked. The officer who delivered the report nodded. "Completely certain, Herr General Feldmarschall. The data comes from multiple sources. These numbers are confirmed." A heavy silence followed. Outside the room, Berlin buzzed with the usual wartime. The room was heavy with cigarette smoke and the sharp smell of ink. Maps of Europe and the Atlantic covered the walls, crisscrossed with pins and strings showing the progress of the war. It was late in the evening, and the men of the German High Command were gathered around a long oak table. Outside, Berlin was dark and tense, but inside this room the war was laid bare in numbers and reports. A courier entered, his boots clicking on the stone floor. He saluted and handed a packet of papers to Wilhelm Keitel, head of the OKW. Keitel opened it carefully, scanning the first page. His brow furrowed, and he read the numbers again as if they might change the second time. The room fell silent. 6,000 ships, Keitel said at last, his voice low. He set the paper on the table for all to see. The Americans built 6,000 ships in 1 year. Alfred Jodl, seated across from him, frowned and leaned forward. 6,000? He asked, his tone sharp. That cannot be right. It's an error. The courier shook his head. The report has been confirmed from multiple sources, Herr Generaloberst. The figure is accurate. There was a pause as the weight of the statement sank in. Keitel exhaled slowly. He had spent his entire life studying military matters, yet the scale of this number seemed beyond comprehension. 6,000 vessels meant 6,000 replacements for every freighter, tanker, and troop ship Germany's U-boats had destroyed. It meant convoys filled with brand new ships, not patched-up relics. Jodl tapped the table with his finger. Show me the details. An aide spread out more documents. They listed the locations of American shipyards: Richmond, Portland, Baltimore, and many others. Each yard was running day and night, 3 shifts a day. There were photographs of Liberty ships lined up in dry docks, workers swarming over them like ants. These figures are not propaganda, the aide said quietly. They are fact. Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, stood at the far end of the table. His face was pale and drawn. He had known for weeks that something was wrong. Sinkings had reached record levels in the spring of 1942, but Allied shipping did not seem to shrink. Instead, convoys were growing. New destroyers and escort carriers appeared faster than expected. He had hoped it was a temporary surge. Now he saw the truth. They are replacing every ship we sink, Donitz said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of bitterness. And more besides. Even with our best efforts, we cannot reduce their strength. This is the end of the tonnage war. The words hung in the air. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jodl's face tightened. Then we must increase our output. Build more U-boats. Push harder. Donitz turned to face him fully. With what resources? Our shipyards are already stretched to the limit. Skilled workers are scarce. Each submarine takes months to complete. Meanwhile, they produce hundreds of vessels each month. He pointed to the photograph of a Liberty ship sliding into the water. They are building ships like factories build automobiles. We cannot match it. Keitel stared at the ceiling for a moment, then lowered his gaze to the maps. His voice was barely above a whisper. If these numbers are true, we cannot win this war. A cold silence filled the room. The men exchanged looks but said nothing. Some stared at the papers as if they were weapons aimed at their hearts. The realization was plain. Even the most brilliant tactics could not overcome such overwhelming production. At last, Jodl broke the silence. We must show this to the Führer. The next morning, the generals gathered again, this time in Hitler's private conference room. Hitler entered briskly, his uniform immaculate, his face tense with irritation. He took his seat at the head of the table. Keitel stepped forward and began to explain the report. He spoke carefully, laying out the numbers and evidence. He described the American shipyards, the workforce of over 600,000, and the rapid pace of construction. When he finished, he placed the report before Hitler. Hitler glanced at the papers but did not pick them up. His expression hardened. These figures are lies, he said flatly. British and American propaganda, designed to frighten us. Donitz cleared his throat. Mein Führer, with respect, the data comes from our own sources. It matches what we have observed at sea. Convoys are growing. Escorts are increasing. Our U-boats cannot keep up. Hitler's eyes flashed. Nonsense. The Americans are soft. They do not have the will for total war. Our U-boats will strangle them yet. The room fell silent again. No one dared to speak. Donitz's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. He had served long enough to know that arguing would only bring rage and suspicion. After the meeting, the generals filed out quietly. In the hallway, Jodl muttered to Keitel, "He will not believe it until it is too late." Keitel's face was gray. He cannot face what these numbers mean. As they walked, they passed aides and junior officers. None of them knew what had been said behind those closed doors, but they sensed the tension. The war still raged on every front: Russia, North Africa, the Atlantic. But here in Berlin, the men at the top were beginning to understand that the tide had turned. In private, some generals spoke of their fear. The army could win battles. The navy could sink ships. The Luftwaffe could bomb cities. But against an enemy that could replace losses endlessly, each victory was hollow. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. That night, Dönitz sat alone in his office, staring at the map of the Atlantic. Tiny pins marked U-boat patrol zones. He moved one pin to a new position, then stopped. What was the point? He now knew the truth. The battle could not be won, no matter how clever the tactics or how brave the crews. The enemy's factories were the real weapon, and they were beyond his reach. The tide of war shifted quietly at first, almost unseen. In early 1942, German U-boats still roamed the Atlantic with deadly effect. British freighters burned at sea, and American tankers sank close to their own shores. The German High Command believed that their naval campaign might still starve Britain into submission. The charts on the walls of Berlin showed rising numbers of ships sunk. For a time, the statistics seemed to tell a story of victory. But beneath the surface, the balance had begun to change. American shipyards were now building faster than the U-boats could destroy. Convoys that had been thin and vulnerable became larger and better protected. Small escort carriers, built quickly in Kaiser's yards, now sailed with the convoys. Their aircraft circled overhead, spotting submarines that once struck unseen. Destroyers with new radar and sonar equipment hunted beneath the waves. The wolf packs that had once terrorized the Atlantic began to take heavy losses. By late summer, German commanders saw the pattern. Sinkings remained high, but the total number of Allied ships at sea kept growing. Where one freighter had been destroyed, two more now appeared in its place. The tonnage war, on which Admiral Dönitz had built his strategy, was slipping away. Without the ability to reduce Allied shipping, Germany's plan to isolate Britain was failing. Britain's ports grew busier each month as supplies poured in: food, fuel, tanks, and aircraft, all carried on new ships fresh from American yards. The consequences stretched far beyond the Atlantic. Secure shipping lanes meant the Allies could plan and execute large operations. In November 1942, Operation Torch began. Allied forces landed in North Africa, opening a new front against German and Italian troops. Thousands of soldiers, along with their weapons and vehicles, crossed the ocean in convoys protected by escorts. German U-boats tried to disrupt the landings, but they could not stop them. For every ship they sank, replacements were ready to sail. Reports of the landings reached Berlin within hours. Hitler raged, demanding that his navy strike harder. But the commanders knew the truth. Their submarines were being hunted relentlessly. Losses were climbing. In some patrol groups, half the boats never returned. Karl Dönitz met with his officers to discuss the worsening situation. The men sat around a long table, their faces drawn and tired. Dönitz spoke plainly. Our objective was to cut off Britain and prevent the Americans from building their strength. We have failed. The enemy grows stronger each month. Our boats are now on the defensive. His words were met with silence. The change was stark. In 1941 and early 1942, Germany had been on the attack, choosing where and when to strike. Now, its navy was reacting, forced to defend against an opponent with overwhelming resources. The initiative had passed to the Allies. They could move troops and supplies across the Atlantic without fear of running out of ships. The U-boat fleet still inflicted losses, but they were no longer decisive. Convoy escorts sank more submarines than ever before. Crews who once felt like hunters now felt like prey. Some U-boats never saw their targets. They were destroyed by depth charges before they could even fire a torpedo. For the German High Command, this was more than a naval problem. The entire strategy of the war depended on controlling resources and supply lines. Without the ability to choke Britain's imports, the Reich faced a growing coalition that could arm and feed itself without limit. The factories of America produced not only ships, but planes, tanks, and trucks in staggering numbers. These weapons flowed through Britain to battlefields across Europe and Africa. The failure of the U-boat campaign also meant that Hitler's larger plans were in jeopardy. Germany had gambled on a short war. Rapid victories in Poland, France, and the early stages of the Russian campaign were supposed to force the Allies to negotiate. Instead, the war dragged on. Every month that passed gave the Allies more strength and Germany less. By the winter of 1942, even Hitler's closest advisors could see the shift. In private, Keitel and Jodl admitted that Germany could no longer cut off Allied supply lines. The best they could hope for was to slow them. The naval war had moved from offense to defense. The pattern repeated itself across the map. In Russia, the army was no longer advancing but struggling to hold ground at Stalingrad. In North Africa, Rommel's forces were retreating after defeats at El Alamein and Tunisia. In the air, Allied bombers struck deeper into Germany each week. Everywhere, the Reich was reacting instead of acting. Dönitz reported to Hitler again in December. The meeting was tense. Charts showing ship production and U-boat losses lay on the table. Hitler studied them in silence. Finally, he spoke. "We must redouble our efforts. Build more submarines. Strike harder." Dönitz kept his voice steady. "Mein Führer, even if we double our production, the Americans will still outbuild us. Each of our losses takes months to replace. They replace theirs in weeks. We cannot win a war of numbers." Hitler's expression hardened, but he did not argue. Deep down, he may have understood the reality, but he refused to speak it aloud. Instead, he ordered new defenses built along the French coast. If the Allies were unstoppable at sea, then Germany would have to meet them on land. The shift was now complete. Germany's grand strategy of encirclement and blockade was dead. The Kriegsmarine, once envisioned as a force to isolate and destroy Britain, was now focused on protecting its own supply routes and defending occupied territory. The U-boat fleet, which had once been Germany's sharpest weapon, became a shield rather than a sword. As 1943 began, the Atlantic was no longer a place of German dominance. The Allies moved freely, carrying the war to every corner of Europe. The sea, which Germany had hoped to control, now served as a highway for its enemies. The men in Berlin could no longer deny it. The war had turned, and from this point forward, Germany would fight only to delay the inevitable. The war ended not only on the battlefields but also in the factories. When the last shots were fired and the maps of Europe were redrawn, the true scale of American production became clear. It was not just numbers on paper or ships on a list. It was the foundation of Allied victory. Generals and historians who studied the war afterward saw that the battles at sea and on land had been shaped by what came out of the shipyards, assembly lines, and steel mills. During the war, soldiers fought and died in places like Stalingrad, Normandy, and the Ardennes. Their courage mattered, but behind them stood millions of workers who never left home. These men and women built the tools of war in quantities the world had never seen. They worked long hours under harsh conditions, welding steel, forging weapons, and loading cargo. Each Liberty ship that slid into the water carried the weight of their labor. The Liberty ship itself became a symbol of this effort. It was a simple, sturdy cargo vessel, not elegant or advanced, but it could be built quickly and in great numbers. The design was plain, with a single stack and a blocky hull. It carried about 10,000 tons of supplies, enough to feed and arm entire divisions. In 1941, there were only a few Liberty ships at sea. By the end of the war, there were thousands. They formed the backbone of the Allied logistics network, sailing in convoys that stretched from horizon to horizon. German sailors who saw these convoys described them as endless. A U-boat commander might sink one or two ships, only to find dozens more appearing the next week. In post-war memoirs, many German officers admitted that it was at this point, when they saw the flow of American ships, that they realized Germany could not win. Tactical victories meant nothing when the enemy could replace every loss many times over. Wilhelm Keitel, in his writings after the war, described the moment he first saw the intelligence report in 1942. He wrote that he felt a chill unlike any he had experienced in battle. The numbers were not abstract to him. They represented a power that Germany could never match. Alfred Jodl, another senior officer, later recalled that he understood, even then, that no strategy could overcome such production. He compared it to trying to dam a river with bare hands while the water kept rising. The lesson was clear. Industrial might could decide a war as surely as any general or battlefield maneuver. The Battle of the Atlantic had been fought with torpedoes and depth charges, but its outcome was decided by factories far from the front lines. American production had overwhelmed German tactics. This was a new kind of warfare, one where logistics were as important as combat. Other nations studied this model after the war. Military planners in Britain, France, and the Soviet Union saw how the United States had organized its economy for total war. Shipyards, railroads, and supply chains had been coordinated with precision. Civilian industries were converted to military purposes almost overnight. Automobile plants built tanks and trucks. Steel mills produced armor plate. Every part of the economy was linked to the war effort. This approach became the standard for modern warfare. Future conflicts would be planned not only with battle maps, but also with production schedules. Generals would ask not just how many divisions they could field, but how many tanks and planes could be replaced each month. The war showed that victory required a constant flow of material, and that flow depended on the strength of industry. The Liberty ships continued to serve long after the war ended. Many were sold to commercial companies or given to allied nations to rebuild their merchant fleets. Some carried food and aid to war-torn countries. Others transported immigrants and refugees. They became part of the post-war world, symbols of a time when mass production had been harnessed for survival. For Germany, the legacy was painful. In their writings and interviews, former officers often returned to that moment in 1942 when they first learned the scale of American shipbuilding. They described it as the point when hope began to fade. Dönitz himself admitted that by late 1942, he knew the U-boat campaign could not succeed. The submarines were still powerful weapons, but they were now fighting a losing battle against an enemy that could not be exhausted. Historians later traced the decline of the Reich to this turning point. Germany had entered the war with bold plans and skilled forces, but it lacked the resources for a long conflict. Once the United States brought its full industrial strength to bear, the outcome became inevitable. The Battle of the Atlantic was not only a contest of ships and submarines, but also of factories and workers. The side that could build more would ultimately win. In American towns like Richmond, Baltimore, and Portland, the shipyards that had run day and night during the war fell silent in the late 1940s. Many were converted back to civilian use or closed entirely, but their impact was lasting. Veterans who sailed on Liberty ships remembered the sight of endless rows of vessels lined up and ready to go. It gave them confidence that they were part of something larger than themselves. In the end, the Liberty ship was more than a vessel. It was a statement of what industrial power could achieve. Each ship launched was a promise that no matter how many were sunk, more would come. This relentless production broke the back of Germany's strategy. It showed that wars are not won only by courage or skill, but by the ability to sustain a fight over years and across oceans. The German generals who sat in Berlin and stared at those numbers in 1942 understood too late what they were seeing. The war they thought they could control had become something far bigger. In their memoirs, they wrote of that moment with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. They realized that their enemy's true weapon was not a single ship or tank, but the combined force of an industrial machine that could not be stopped.